The handcuffs closed at 11:40 in the morning, and the only sound in the lecture hall was a single dry click that carried all the way to the back row. 212 students sat frozen in their seats. The man at the front of the room did not flinch. He had been mid-sentence, chalk in his right hand, the word Reconstruction, half written on the board behind him, when the campus officer crossed the room and took his wrist. He let the chalk fall. It broke on the floor in two clean pieces. He did not raise his voice. He did not pull away. He looked at the officer once, the way a man looks at weather he has lived through before, and then he looked back at his students and said only, in a voice steady enough to read the time off, that they should keep their notebooks open. What happened next is the reason you are here, not the arrest. What 212 students did in the 90 seconds after it. But before we get to the silence in the hallway and the thing the dean found taped to the inside of a desk drawer, you need to understand who this man was and why a uniformed officer believed, with total confidence, that he was looking at someone who did not belong at the front of that room. His name was Marcus Tillman, and on the morning of his arrest he had been teaching at Halvorsen University for exactly 6 days. Let me take you back, because the distance between what that officer saw and what was true is the entire shape of this story. Marcus grew up in a part of the city the university brochures did not photograph. His grandmother raised him in a third-floor apartment above a laundromat, and the building shook gently every time the big dryers spun, a low hum he learned to read like a heartbeat. Her name was Odessa Tillman, and she'd cleaned other people's offices for 31 years, including, for 9 of those years, the administrative offices of the very university where her grandson would one day be put in handcuffs. She used to come home with her shoes worn paper, thin at the heel, and her coat smelling of floor wax, and she would sit at the kitchen table and read. She read everything: library discards with the spines taped, newspapers left behind on the bus, a single battered hardcover she had carried out of a donation bin 20 years before, a history of the years after the Civil War, its cover the colour of a brick left in the rain. She read it so many times the pages had gone soft as cloth. On the inside cover, in her careful upright hand, she had written one line. Marcus could recite it before he could tie his shoes. Know the whole story she had written, because the people who only know half of it will try to tell you where you belong. That book is the object to remember. Keep it in mind. It comes back. Odessa did not have a high school diploma. What she had was a question she asked Marcus every single night, the same words, never varied. She would set down whatever she was reading and look at him over the top of her glasses and ask him what he had learned that day that nobody could ever take back, not what grade he got, not whether the teacher liked him, what he had learned that could not be repossessed. A grade can be lost, she told him once. The apartment can be lost, a job can be on an afternoon, by a man who never learned your name. But a thing you understand all the way down, that stays. That is the only property they cannot come for. Marcus learned to answer her every night. He learned to go looking for an answer during the day so he would have one ready. Some nights the answer was small, a word he had not known that morning, the name of a river, the reason the sky turned the colour it did before a storm. Some nights it was larger than the apartment. She received them all the same way, with a slow nod and a hand reaching across the table to rest a moment on his, and then she would tell him to write it down. Because a thing written is a thing kept twice. He kept a notebook by his bed before he was 10 years old, a cheap thing with a cardboard cover, and he filled it and filled another and another, and she never once read them, because she said the notebook was his property, and a person's property is their own business. By the time he was 12, he had read most of the history shelf at the branch library, 4 blocks over, and the librarian, a quiet woman who never made him feel watched, started setting books aside for him under the counter. She would slide them across without a word, a finger tapping the cover once, a small private signal that meant this one is for you. He did not know until years later that she had been buying some of them with her own money from the discard sale because the branch did not stock what a boy like him was hungry for. People who look will find the people worth finding. That librarian looked. So did his grandmother. The whole story of his life is the difference between the people who looked and the people who refused to. Here is what you need to understand about the years that followed. Marcus Tillman did not have an easy line drawn from that apartment to the front of a university lecture hall. There was no scholarship that arrived like sunrise. There were 2 jobs through college, a stretch of 18 months, where he left school entirely because the money ran out and his grandmother's health did not, and a graduate program he entered at 31. Older than the professors who taught some of his seminars. He wrote his dissertation on the Reconstruction era, the same decade his grandmother's brick-coloured book had covered, the promises made to freed people and the machinery built to break those promises. He defended it in a room of 7 scholars and walked out with a doctorate and a debt that would follow him for years. He was 44 years old the autumn he was hired at Halvorsen. He had spent the previous decade teaching at a community college across the state, the kind of place that does not make the rankings, teaching 5 courses a semester to students who worked nights, and he had been, by every measure that the students themselves used, one of the best teachers any of them had ever had. The hiring committee at Halvorsen had read his work. One of them had wept reading a chapter of his book on the bus. They brought him in to teach American history to undergraduates who had grown up in houses with libraries in them. He arrived with 2 suitcases and the brick-coloured book wrapped in a sweater at the bottom of one of them. Now, the officer. His name was Brent Coyle, and he had worked campus security at Halvorsen for 11 years. He was not a cruel man in the way movies make men cruel. He coached his daughter's soccer team. He brought donuts for the dispatch desk on Fridays. What he had, instead of cruelty, was a picture in his head of what a Halvorsen professor looked like, a picture built over 11 years of watching the same kind of man walk the same marble corridors, and Marcus Tillman did not match the picture. That mismatch, that small daily arithmetic that some people run without ever once saying it out loud, is where this whole thing began. It began with a parking decal. The faculty lot behind the history building required a decal, a small blue sticker issued in the first week of the semester. Marcus, in his first 6 days, had filled out the form, paid the fee, and been told the decals were back-ordered and would arrive the following week. He had a temporary paper permit signed by the department sitting on his dashboard. On the morning of the 6th day, he parked in the faculty lot, placed the paper permit where it could be seen, and walked into the building to teach his 11 o'clock class. At 10:50, Officer Coyle walked the faculty lot. He saw a car he did not recognize in a spot he believed belonged to faculty. He saw a paper permit, which to him looked like the kind of thing anyone could print. He did not radio the department to ask. He did not check the name against the new hire list that had been emailed to his own office 4 days earlier. He ran the plate, found it registered to a Marcus Tillman, at an address in a part of the city he associated with everything except professors, and he made a decision in the parking lot that he would spend the rest of his career trying to explain. He decided to go find the man. This is the part where I need you to sit with 2 clocks at once. There is the clock on the wall of the lecture hall, where Marcus had just written the word Reconstruction, and was turning to explain why the year 1877 mattered more than any year his students had been taught to memorize. And there is the clock in Officer Coyle's head, already certain, already past the question and into the answer. At 11:38, Coyle entered the building. At 11:39, he stood in the doorway of the lecture hall and watched a black man in a grey jacket writing on a chalkboard in front of 212 students, and instead of the question that any of those students could have answered for him in one breath, "Who is that?" he asked a different question, the wrong question, the question that this entire story exists to correct. He asked it loud enough for the room to hear. He asked the man at the board what he was doing in there. Marcus turned around. He set down the chalk. In a voice that did not rise, he said that he was teaching a class. The room was quiet in the way a room gets quiet when something is about to go. Wrong, and everyone in it can feel it before they can name it. Coyle asked for identification. Marcus said his faculty card had not yet been issued, that he was new, that the department could confirm him in 30 seconds with a phone call, and that the officer was welcome to make that call from right where he stood. He gestured calm toward the phone on the wall by the door. Coyle did not make the call. What he did instead was cross the room. And here is the thing I want you to hold on to. The small detail the news would later get wrong, and the students would later get exactly right. Marcus did not argue. He did not plant his feet. He did not deliver a speech about who he was. He had spent a lifetime learning that the man who explains himself to someone who has already decided has handed that someone the only thing he was missing, which is time. So Marcus said nothing about his doctorate. He said nothing about his book. He simply turned to his students, his voice level as a tabletop, and told them to keep their notebooks open. That class would resume, and that the page they were on was page 61. Then the cuffs closed, 11:40 in the morning. One dry click now. Before I tell you what 212 students did, let me show you the 6 days that came before, because the room did not erupt out of nowhere. Something had been built in that room, quietly, in less than a week. And you cannot understand the walkout without understanding the teaching. On his first day, Marcus had not started with the syllabus. He had started with a question. He asked the room how many of them could name the year the Civil War ended. Every hand went up. Then he asked how many of them could name what happened in the 12 years after, and the hands came down like a slow tide going out. He let the silence sit. He did not shame anyone. He said gently that this was not their failure, that it was the most deliberately forgotten decade in the country's memory, and that for the next 4 months they were going to learn the half of the story that the people who wrote the textbooks had hoped they would never go looking for. He walked to the window while he said it. Outside, students crossed the quad in the thin autumn light, and he watched them a moment before he turned back. He told the room that history was not a list of dates to be survived until the exam. He told them it was a set of decisions made by people who could have decided otherwise, and that the most dangerous thing a person could believe was that the way things are now is the way things had to be. He said that someone, at some point, had decided what these students would be taught and what they would not, and that the decision had been made for reasons, and that finding the reasons was the entire job. Then he picked up the chalk and wrote a single year on the board, 1877, and he asked the room what they thought of bought and sold that year. Nobody answered. He smiled the first time any of them had seen it, and said, good that the silence meant they were finally standing at the edge of the part nobody had wanted them to see. A young woman in the third row named Priya Raman wrote that sentence down word for word. She would testify to it later, though testify is too formal a word for what she actually did, which was stand up in a crowded room and refuse to sit back down. By the third day, students who were not enrolled in the class had started showing up to sit in the back. Word moved the way it moves on a campus, faster than any official channel. There is a new history professor, people said, and he teaches like the building is on fire, and the only way out is to actually understand something. He did not lecture from notes. He walked the aisles. He asked a question and then waited through the discomfort of the silence until someone real answered. Not the answer they thought he wanted, the answer they actually had. On the fourth day, he told them about his grandmother, not as a story about himself, as a story about a method. He told them that the smartest person he had ever known had cleaned offices for 31 years and had taught him to ask, every night, what he had learned that could not be taken back. He did not say where she had cleaned offices. He did not yet know himself that one of the buildings on her route had been the administration building 200 yards from where he now stood. He would learn that later, and it would undo him in a way the handcuffs never could. On the fifth day, a student stayed after class. A quiet young man named Theo Brandt, the kind of student who sits near the door and rarely speaks. Theo's father was a lawyer. Theo had grown up in a house with a library in it, the exact kind of house Marcus had been hired to teach the children of. Theo stayed behind and said, awkwardly, that he had never had a class make him feel that there was a whole country underneath the country he thought he lived in. Marcus told him to hold on to that feeling, because it was the beginning of an education, and most people spent their whole lives avoiding. Theo would remember that on the 6th day when he was the first one out of his seat. Keep Theo in mind. He matters at the door. So that was the room. 6 days old. Built on a question about what cannot be repossessed. Taught by a man who had been hired for exactly the brilliance the officer in the doorway could not see. Now you understand what was sitting in those 212 chairs when the cuffs clicked. Not a passive audience. A room that had been taught for 6 days that the official version is usually missing the most important half. 11:40 and 1 second. The chalk lay broken on the floor. Officer Coyle had Marcus by the wrist and was turning him toward the door. Marcus's face was still. His hands, behind him now, did not shake, though a muscle in his jaw moved once and went still again. He was thinking, he would say much later, about his grandmother, about the floor wax smell of her coat, about the line in the brick-coloured book. He was not thinking about being right. He was thinking about being calm, because calm was the one thing in that room that belonged entirely to him and that no one could take. And then Priya Raman stood up. She did not shout. She closed her notebook, slid it into her bag and stood, and the scrape of her chair was the loudest thing the room had heard since the click. Coyle looked at her. She looked back at him and said, clearly, that she was not going to sit in a class without its teacher. Then she walked down the aisle, past the officer, past Marcus, and out the door into the hallway, and she stood there, alone, just outside the room. For 3 seconds nobody followed. 3 seconds is a long time. Long enough for a thing to die in the cradle. Then Theo Brandt stood up, the lawyer's son, the boy from the house with the library. He did not say anything at all. He just gathered his books and walked out and stood beside Priya in the hall. And then the room came apart, in the best possible way. It was not a stampede. That is what the early news reports got wrong, the word chaos. It was the opposite of chaos. It was 210 more people standing up one after another, gathering their things, and walking in something close to silence, out of the lecture hall and into the corridor, until the only people left inside were Officer Coyle and a man in handcuffs and a broken piece of chalk on the floor. Coyle stood in an empty room. Through the open door he could see them, the whole class, filling the marble hallway, not blocking anything, not chanting, just standing, 212 students with their backs to the lecture hall and their faces toward the man in the grey jacket, waiting. The silence of that hallway is the sound at the centre of this story. It was louder than any protest. A protest can be dismissed as noise. This was the absence of an audience, and an empty classroom is the one thing a university cannot survive the sight of. Marcus, in the doorway, in handcuffs, saw it, and for the first time that morning, something moved in his face that he could not keep still. Now I have to slow down, because the next 40 minutes are where the story turns from a wound into a reckoning, and every piece of it matters. A teaching assistant named Carol Whitfield had been standing at the back of the hall when it happened. Carol had worked in the history department for 22 years, longer than any professor in it. The kind of person who knows where every file is, and who actually runs the place behind the people whose names are on the doors. She had seen new faculty come and go. She had read Marcus Tillman's file the week it arrived, including the cover letter, including the line where he wrote that he had been raised by a woman who cleaned offices and taught him everything. Carol was not a dramatic person. In 22 years she had never once raised her voice in that building. She raised it now, not at the students, at the situation. She crossed the hall, took out her phone, and did the thing the officer had refused to do 6 minutes earlier. She called the department chair, and then, because the chair did not pick up fast enough for what she was watching, she called the dean's office directly, and she said 11 words that started the avalanche. There is an officer arresting Professor Tillman in front of his class. Professor. She used the word like a key turning in a lock. The dean of the college was a woman named Eleanor Voss, and she was, at that moment, in a budget meeting on the 4th floor of the administration building, the same building Odessa Tillman had cleaned for 9 years, though no one in the story knew that yet. Dean Voss took the call standing up and was out of her chair before the sentence finished. She did not send an assistant. She did not draft a statement. She walked fast, the 400 yards from the administration building to the history building, and she would say later that she could hear the silence of that hallway before she could see it, that there is a particular quality to 200 people, being quiet on purpose, that travels through a building like a change in air pressure. Meanwhile, in the hall, something was happening that Officer Coyle had not planned for and could not control. The students had begun, quietly, to do the only thing a class trained by Marcus Tillman would think to do. They had opened their notebooks. Priya was reading aloud from her notes, picking up exactly where the lecture had stopped, page 61, the meaning of the year 1877. And the students around her were listening, and a few were taking notes on their own notes. And the lesson was, impossibly, continuing in the hallway without its teacher, because he had taught them for 6 days that the teacher is not the point. The understanding is the point, and understanding is the one thing that cannot be repossessed. It started small. Priya had not planned it. She simply could not stand in a hallway doing nothing, while the man who had taught her to ask better questions stood 10 feet away in handcuffs. So she did the thing he had trained her to do, which was to keep going. She read a sentence, then another. A young man beside her, whose name nobody would ever learn from the footage, asked her quietly to read the part again about the compromise, and she did. And then someone behind him asked a question about it. A real question. The kind Marcus had spent 6 days teaching them was the only kind worth asking, and a girl near the wall answered it. In a marble corridor with an officer 20 feet away, the class kept teaching itself, voice handing to voice, and the sound of it was so far from a protest that the few staff members who came to the doors to see what was happening did not understand at first what they were looking at. They had expected anger, they found a seminar. Marcus, still in cuffs in the doorway, heard his grandmother's question coming back to him in the voice of a 20-year-old he had known for 6 days. He looked at the floor. The muscle in his jaw moved again. Officer Coyle, 11 years on the job, found himself standing in a doorway holding a handcuffed man, while 200 students conducted a history lecture without him in the hall outside. He had begun, the students would say later, to look smaller. Not because anyone said anything to him, because the situation had reorganized itself around a truth he had gotten wrong, and he was the only person in the building still standing on the wrong side of it. Dean Voss arrived at 11:51. She came around the corner and stopped. She took in the hallway, the students, the open notebooks, the empty lecture hall, the officer, the man in handcuffs. She was a person who had spent 30 years in universities and had learned to read a room faster than anyone, and she read this one in about 2 seconds. She walked directly to Officer Coyle. She did not raise her voice. The students would remark on that afterward, how quietly she spoke, how the quiet was somehow worse than shouting would have been. She asked the officer if he knew who he had arrested. Coyle said he had a man without faculty identification parked in a faculty spot. The dean said the man's name. She said it the way you set down something heavy. Marcus Tillman. She said that he was a professor of history, hired by a committee she had chaired, that his book was on the reading list of her own graduate seminar, and that the temporary permit on his dashboard had been signed by the department 4 days ago and copied to campus security. To Coyle's own office, in an email she could pull up on her phone in the next 10 seconds if he would like to see it. She did not gloat. There was no triumph in it. There was only the slow, terrible clarity of a fact arriving in a room that had been built to keep it out. That clarity is the cathartic engine of this whole story. And I want you to notice that Marcus did not generate it. He never said a word in his own defense. The institution that had been about to fail him was forced, by 212 students and one 22-year veteran of the department, to turn around and name him correctly. The room did not give him power. It finally stopped blocking the door. Coyle uncuffed him at 11:54. The cuffs might come off with the same dry click they had gone on with, and in the silence of that hallway every student heard it, and the meaning of the sound had completely reversed. Marcus rubbed his wrists once. He did not look at the officer. He looked at his students, at Priya holding her notebook open, at Theo, standing where he had stood for the last 14 minutes, and he said the only thing he said in that entire hallway. He said thank you, and then he said that class was not over, and that they should all please come back inside. because they were on page 61 and he intended to finish the lecture. And they did, every one of them. They filed back into the lecture hall, 212 students, and they sat down, and Marcus Tillman picked up a fresh piece of chalk, and with his wrists still red from the cuffs, he turned to the board and finished the sentence he had been writing when the officer first walked in. He taught for another 40 minutes. The dean stood at the back of the room and listened to the whole thing. She would say later that it was the best lecture she had heard in 20 years, and that she had spent most of it trying not to think about how close the university had come to losing the right to claim it had ever happened there at all. That was the day. But a day is just a stone, and what matters is the water it moves. Let me tell you what the stone moved. The video, of course, existed. In a room of 212 people, dozens of phones had been raised the moment the cuffs appeared. By that evening the footage was everywhere, but not the footage you would expect. The clip that travelled was not the arrest. It was the hallway. It was Priya Raman reading from her notebook to a corridor full of silent students, while a man stood handcuffed in a doorway, teaching, somehow, by having taught them well enough that they could carry it themselves. People who had never met Marcus Tillman watched a 20-year-old finish his sentence for him, and they understood, without anyone explaining it, exactly what they were looking at. The university moved quickly, the way institutions move when the alternative is being seen clearly. There was an investigation. Officer Coyle was placed on leave within 48 hours. And here is where the consequence took the shape that consequence takes in stories like this one, which is to say not a vengeful shape but a mirror's shape. Coyle was not fired in a blaze. He was reassigned. The man who had spent 11 years deciding who belonged in which rooms was moved to a post in the basement records office of the same administration building. A windowless job was to file and retrieve documents, to fetch the histories of people he would never meet, and to be, for the rest of his time at the university, exactly as invisible as he had once decided Marcus Tillman should be. He had asked a man on the phone at the front of a room what he was doing there. Now he sat in a room where no one ever asked him anything at all. Sometimes justice does not need to shout. It just moves a person to the basement and lets the quiet do the rest. Carol Whitfield. The teaching assistant who had made the call was promoted that spring to department administrator, a position that had been left vacant for 2 years because no one had wanted to admit how much of the building's actual work she had already been doing for free. The new title came with the office on the corner, the one with 2 windows. She hung nothing on the walls for a month. Then she hung one thing, a framed photocopy of a cover letter with one sentence underlined, the line about a woman who cleaned offices and taught a boy everything. Raman changed her major to history. Theo Brandt, the lawyer's son, did not change his major, but he changed something harder to see. He started showing up to office hours not with questions about the test, but with questions about the country, and 4 years later he would write a law school essay about the difference between the law and justice that began with a description of a hallway gone silent, and he would get in everywhere he applied. But the part of the aftermath that undid Marcus, the part that brings the brick-coloured book back around, happened 3 weeks after the arrest in the basement archive of all places. The university, in the course of its investigation, had pulled employment records going back decades, and a clerk processing them noticed a name: Tillman. The clerk, not knowing the story, mentioned to Carol Whitfield that there had been another Tillman on the payroll once, in custodial services for 9 years, ending 2 decades back. Carol went very still. She pulled the file herself, and there it was, Odessa Tillman. Custodian, administration building, 3rd shift, 9 years. The same building where Dean Voss had taken the phone call standing up. The same floors. Marcus now walked, as a professor had been mopped after midnight for 9 years, by the woman who taught him the only question that mattered. Carol brought him the file herself. She did not say anything. She just set it on his desk and let him open it. He looked at his grandmother's name in a university record, her dates of service, her shift, and the small box where someone had once written her job description in 3 words. And he sat in his office for a long time with the door closed. He had spent his whole life believing he was the first Tillman to belong in those buildings. He learned that afternoon that he was the second, that she had been there first in the dark with a mop and a worn coat on the same marble he now stood on in the light. He read the file twice. There was a line for emergency contact, and in it, in a younger version of the handwriting he knew from the inside cover of a book, she had written a name and a phone number. The name was his. The number was the apartment above the laundromat, the one with the dryers that hummed through the floor. She had listed a 9-year-old boy as the person to call. He understood, looking at it, that on every one of those third shifts, mopping floors, she would never be allowed to walk in daylight as anything but invisible. She had carried him with her, that he had been her one line in the official record, the single thing she had written down to be kept twice. He set the file down very carefully, as though it might bruise. He took the brick-coloured book out of his desk drawer, where he had kept it since his first day, and he opened it to the inside cover, and he read her handwriting again. Know the whole story, because the people who only know half of it will try to tell you where you belong. She had known the whole story. She had cleaned the building that her grandson would one day be arrested for teaching in, and she had raised him to know more than the people who would one day put him in cuffs, and she had been right about all of it, decades before any of it happened. Marcus did one thing with what he learned, and it is the thing this story ends on. The following year, with the quiet support of Dean Voss and a department that had nearly lost him, Marcus Tillman started a program at Halvorsen. It was small. It found the people who worked the buildings, the custodians, the groundskeepers, the night shift staff, whose names the faculty rarely learned, and it offered them, free, the thing his grandmother had never been given and had built herself anyway, which was access to the library, to the lectures, to the classrooms after hours, to the whole story, the half they were not supposed to go looking for. He named it after her. He did not name it grandly. He named it the Odessa Tillman Program, and he had a small brass plaque made, and he asked that it be mounted not in the grand entrance of the History Building, but in the Administration Building, on the 3rd floor, on the wall outside the office that Odessa had cleaned for 9 years on the 3rd shift. The plaque went up on a Tuesday. Marcus came after the building had emptied, after dark, the way she always had, and he stood in front of it alone. It was just his grandmother's name in brass, mounted at eye level. On the floor she had walked in the dark for 9 years. He reached out and touched it once, the way you touch something to make sure it is real, and not a thing you only wished into the wall. Then he went home where the brick-coloured book sat on the shelf, its cover the colour of a brick left in the rain, its pages soft as cloth, one line in a careful upright hand on the inside of the cover. He read it one more time before he turned off the light. Here is what I want you to take from this, because the story is not really about a parking decal or an officer or even an arrest. The story is about the gap between what a person looks like and what a person knows, and about who gets to decide which one counts. There was a man at the front of a room who had earned the right to stand there twice over, once with a doctorate and once with a lifetime, and there was a uniform in a doorway who saw none of it, because he was looking at the wrong thing and asking the wrong question. The question was never whether Marcus Tillman belonged in that room. He had always belonged in that room. The only thing in doubt, for 90 seconds in a marble hallway, was whether the people around him would say so before it was too late. 212 of them did. They stood up, they walked out, and then they walked back in, and they let him teach, which is the only ending this kind of story is allowed to have. So I will leave you with the question his grandmother asked him every night, the one she carried out of a donation bin in a brick-coloured book and into a 3rd-floor apartment above a laundromat, the one that turned out to be the most valuable thing anyone ever gave him. What did you learn today that nobody can ever take back? Sit with that one. Carry it the way he carried it. And the next time you find yourself in a room deciding who belongs in it, ask the right question first, because the most important person in any room is almost never the one the room expects, and the cost of finding out too late is a silence you will hear for the rest of your life.